All right, so we're going to start talking about lighting. So I'm just going to set up a basic scene to demonstrate the different types of lights that exist in Godot and the different properties that we can use with them. So I'm going to create a new 3D scene, and I'll just call this lighting example. And I'll save this in my scenes folder. And so for your project, for your project 2, obviously part of what you want to do is add lights to the scene to add some more visual dynamics. So I'm just going to be talking about the lighting. I'm not really going to be demonstrating scene design in this case, but I just want to go over some of the different properties that you can use. So I'm just going to make something simple. I'm just going to throw a little room in here. Maybe I'll use a window. Room. And I'll add the player so we can run the scene and see it in the live game view. And I'll add, let's add a couple models. So I'll add our chair model. Okay, so I'll just use that as an example just for the lights. All right, so when we first start a Godot scene, we see this kind of default lighting, and there's two components to this. You can see them up here in the toolbar. There's this default sunlight, and there's the default world environment. And if we turn both of those off, we kind of see what Godot looks like if we just run the scene without any lights. There's just a gray default background, and then we see kind of the mesh and the texture or the material that's associated with the room mesh, but there's no lighting, so we don't see, for example, the chair just overlaps with the background because the chair doesn't have a texture. And there's no shadows, there's no illumination or anything. So Godot has these default lights, so you can just start designing a scene. And this is a good way to just get started understanding what usually goes into lighting a scene. So we'll look at those defaults first, and then we'll add some other lights on our own. So as we've seen before, if you want to add these defaults into the scene, if you open this dropdown, you can add the defaults using these buttons. And you can also change the parameters here. So you can kind of play with parameters of these defaults in this dropdown. So let's start with our environment. So if I add that into the scene, the button to toggle it goes away, and we just have this world environment. And so over in the inspector, if we click on the environment, we can see the properties related to the environment. And so we can see there's this default background, and there's a few options for the background. So if we just use a color, that's kind of what that would look like without, any real background. We can choose a color, so we can just have like a random color for the background. Or we can have the sky. And the sky is a little bit more complex, and it has its own sky element inside of it. So with the sky element, we can create a new sky, we can make skies. But if we look at the properties, there's also some options in there. So we start to get into this kind of like buried option tree. But once we get into this procedural sky, you can see there's different types of skies as well. We'll stick with the procedural sky, but the panorama sky uses like textures for each section. There's a few different, you could add just your own shader there. But the default sky is the properties that we see here. So it's buried pretty deep in here, but we can see there's the color for the top of the sky. There's a color for the horizon, and then there's a color for the ground. And so you can change all those properties just by changing these colors. So if you want like a brighter scene, you can make the sky top brighter. If you want the horizon to be a different color, you can kind of play around with that. And then the ground you can play around with as well. And so you can kind of design the sky a little bit. And those colors are going to reflect off of our materials as well. So if we make really extreme colors in the sky, we're going to see those colors reflect off, especially some of the lighter materials. You can kind of see some of the highlights and stuff in the chair. And if we do something like, really extreme, like this green color, that's not realistic, but, you might have a alien world or something like that. And you can see that that sky is reflecting off of our materials. And then we can change kind of the intensity of the sky with the energy multiplier. So if it's dark out, if it's night, you might have this be a lower value. And if it's daytime, you might have it be a higher value. The default is just 1. There's a lot of other stuff you can play with in here, but we'll kind of leave those alone for now because we can get really sidetracked with lots of different options. But I'm going to set these back to the default for now. So that's kind of the main background that you probably would want to use. There's a lot of other stuff that you can do with the environment besides the sky and the background. So you can change the ambient light. If you're not using a lot of lighting or you want kind of a neutral look, you could add some ambient light to the scene just to make things brighter or kind of, tinted a certain way. That could be useful. And then you can turn the amount of ambient light up or turn down the sky contribution, and you'll see more of the ambient light. So you can play around with those. There's some more sort of specific rendering styles in here. So a lot of these are more kind of advanced ways of setting up the rendering. You could play around with these. For example, you could turn on ambient occlusion, and you'll see more kind of like dark parts and shadows in your mesh. All of this stuff is going to add to the overall processing for the scene. So if you put a lot of this stuff in here, if you kind of set up all these different things, the scene might start to kind of slow down at a certain point depending on what computer you're on. Fog is also another option in here that might be useful. So you can turn fog on. This is a really useful way if you have a big scene to hide stuff that's in the background so that you're not rendering all the stuff all the time. And you can also make the scene, kind of reveal at a different pace than it normally would. There's also volumetric fog, which is a little bit more, you can see that it's applied in a slightly different way. It's a little bit more realistic in terms of how fog interacts with the lighting. And of course, there's lots of parameters that we can play with here to change the color of the fog or do different things as well. So all that stuff just really depends on the look that you want to go for with your scene. You may want to add that stuff, or you may want to just leave the defaults. So that's all just the world environment, and that affects the lighting setup, but those aren't actually lights. So we can look at some lights that we can add. So the default sun is a light, so we can add that into the scene. And so this is a directional light. This is one of the 3 types of lights in Godot. Directional light means that there's a direction, but there's no position. So you can see how the light affects the scene if you look at the shadows. So you can see the light is kind of pointing down in this direction, and it creates those shadows coming off the wall and coming off the chair as well. And this kind of will, set the look of the scene and sort of the time of day. And if you look at the light, there should be Oh, it's actually, yeah, it's just the transform. So if we look at the transform, you can see the default rotation here. And if we reset that, we're going to see that it's pointing, the default rotation is just along the Z axis. So if we set it to the default rotation, you can see the light is only applying to one side of the room and the chair. And so most likely we want to kind of rotate down and over a little bit to get those kind of shadows. So the position doesn't matter. If I change the position of this light, you know, it doesn't actually affect anything about the scene because the light is only coming from a direction. So you could move it over here if it's kind of, you know, blocking your view, but the position really doesn't matter. So the default rotation, I think it was 180, something like that. Maybe 120. So that's a directional light. With the light itself, we can change the color. So you might want like a slightly yellow color if you want it to look like the sun. But you can also use non-realistic colors there. You can change the level of lighting. And you can have that, you know, animated or change in different ways. You can change the amount of indirect energy. So this is calculating how much the sun is bouncing off other things. It's a little harder to see the effects of that, but you can see it, you know, things start to glow a little bit more. You can also make the light negative, which is kind of fun. It basically just has the opposite effect of what you have it set up for. And then you can, we won't do this, but there's a bake mode. So when we were looking at different rendering systems last week, we talked about this a little bit. And basically with the bake mode, what bake means is you can pre-bake some of your effects. So that way it's not rendering in real time. We'll usually just be using it rendering in real time. And that's fine for most of the time for the stuff that we're going to do. But if you have a scene that has a lot of different stuff going on, you can bake the lights so that when you build the scene, it'll just bake the lighting into the textures. And so the lighting won't be able to change. But if you're not actually changing the lighting much in your scene, then it won't really matter. It'll just bake all of that stuff so it doesn't have to calculate it. But most of the time we can just leave this on dynamic and we don't really have to worry about it. All right. So that's our directional light. We can also play with the shadow. So you can see the shadow here. You can turn the shadow off if you don't want shadow. You'll still get lighter and darker sides of the mesh, but you won't get the shadow on other objects. So you can turn the shadow on and off, and then you can play with the bias. This is like how far away from the object the shadow starts. And then you can play with the normal bias, which is sort of, you can see, if we zoom in, you can kind of see it's playing more fine-grained. We can play with the opacity of the shadow, so we can make it a little transparent if we want to see through it more. And then we can blur the edges of the shadow. So we can blur it. If we have 0 blur, it's going to be very, you can see kind of the pixelated edges. So we want to have a little bit of blur. If it's very blurry, then it just kind of looks like a little mush. So that could be good if that's the style that you like. It may be, you know, unrealistic. So usually I kind of leave those as the default, but those are all the shadow settings that we can play with. So that's our directional light. We'll add a few more lights to the scene and just go over the differences. So the directional light, again, has a direction but no position. Another type of light, if we just type in light when we're looking for nodes to add, you'll see the 3 main lights. So the directional light we just covered, the omni light, and then the spotlight. So the omni light is kind of the opposite of the directional light. It has a position and no direction. So I'll move this up here. And The Omni light is good for environmental instances of lighting, like if you have like a lamp or something like that that you want in your scene, or a source of light. One thing that I always point out, which may seem obvious, but sometimes people don't realize, is that the light is just emanating color, essentially. It doesn't actually look like anything in the scene. So there's this little icon that shows there's a light here, but when I run the scene, we don't see anything there. So if you want to have a light in your scene, normally it's a combination of a mesh that looks like a light and then an actual instance of a 3D light. So with our Omni light, we have a lot of different properties to play with. Of course, the position matters. And you can see if I move this, closer to the chair, it's going to reflect more light onto the chair. And so the chair will be brighter. And if I move this farther away, then the chair is less bright. And it kind of affects the side of the chair that we're normally on. And so we can move it around. The rotation doesn't matter. It's always going to send light in this basic sphere shape, so you can ignore the rotation. And then this little dot controls the range of the light. So obviously, the larger we make this, the more stuff the light will affect. With the Omni light, there's a lot of properties that we can play with. So you can play with the range here, which we just looked at. We can also play with that in the editor. We can play with the attenuation, which is basically the brightness, or how much it kind of falls off as we get away from the center. So you can see if the attenuation is very low, that there's basically a solid line where the edge of the range is. So it applies like this full amount of light to the entire range, to any surface in that range. If we set the attenuation to its default 1, the light drops off at a much faster rate. And then, anything in between that, if we go really high, you're not going to see much light added here. So normally I would leave this on the default. If you want kind of like more stylized or more obvious lighting, you might turn the attenuation into this negative zone a little bit. We also can change the shadow mode, but we haven't added the shadow yet, so let's ignore that for now. So then there's the light itself, which has all the same properties as our directional light. So you might want a specific color for the light. I'm going to use kind of a ridiculous color just to make it a little more clear which light this is and what it's doing. So you can see when I make the color green, we get those green highlights on the chair. And if I increase the energy, of course it gets brighter. Indirect energy is going to make it bounce onto other things more. And then we can also change how it interacts with the fog, although I don't have fog in the scene right now, so I'll ignore that for now. We can make this light negative as well, and we can change the bake mode. There's also a cull mask. You can use this to make the light ignore certain objects. I don't think that we'll probably have much use for that, but it does exist if you're curious what that does. You can turn on the shadow. So this light doesn't have shadows by default. Again, the more stuff we do, the more processing we do. Like if we add lots of shadows, the more our graphics card is working to render the scene. So the worse the performance is going to be. So with a couple lights in the scene, you're not going to notice it. But if you have tons of lights that are all dynamically adding shadows to stuff, eventually you're going to start to get some slower performance. With our shadow, we don't really see much shadow here. So let's see if we can increase the energy of the light just to see more shadow. Still don't really see it. There we go. Okay, so now you can kind of see that shadow going in the other direction. So it's going in the opposite direction of our directional shadow. And this just based on the position of this light. So let's actually turn off our directional light for a moment. So now you can see the shadow, and you have all the same things with the shadow. You have the bias, the normal bias, and then opacity. So we kind of have all the same properties there, as well as the blur. So again, I would probably not use a ton of shadow if you're got lots of lights in your scene, but if you want a really specific look, where maybe you're in an enclosed space and you want to create a lot of shadows, you can turn that shadow on. Let's turn that off for now. And I'm just going to duplicate this light and move it over here. And so you'll see when you're using an Omni light, you'll usually do it for like some interior lighting. And you can make a bunch of them and kind of create like a little lighting scheme. We'll see that if I change this color, it doesn't affect the other light. So with the material, it is going to affect the other light. With the lights, it doesn't do that. So we can kind of create a, dynamic lighting scheme by adding some different lights. And I'm doing it kind of in a dramatic sense to make it look a lot more obvious what's changing and what's happening in the scene. But usually you don't want it to be so over the top unless that's kind of the style that you're going for. All right, so that is the Omni light. Let's see if we want to go over. We can also play with sort of the fade distance, but I don't think we need to go into that level of detail. Yeah. Okay, so we've got our directional light, our Omni light, and then the last one is the spotlight. This is the one that has both a direction and a position. So that's kind of the main difference between our different lights. So that should be pretty, if you're familiar with the concept of a spotlight, it should be, pretty clear how this will work. But the spotlight is going to have a direction and a position. So if we want to put a spotlight on our model here, we can position the light above the chair. And then this little cone determines the size and the distance of the light. So if I rotate this guy down, you can see where the light is going to affect. So I can drag this down here, and then I can make this either bigger or smaller. And then let's change the color of this light so we can see the effect. Maybe I'll do like an orange. And let's turn off our other lights for a second. So you can see that orange is applying just to the chair. And of course, all the other properties are the same. The more energy we add, the brighter it's going to be. If I move this guy farther down, it's going to also affect the floor below the chair. If I turn on the shadow, we'll see a shadow under the chair. And all those other properties are pretty much the same. So yeah, that's pretty much it as far as lighting goes. Of course, a lot of lighting is designing the scene and combining different colors and setting things up so that they look appealing based on the design and sort of goals for your scene. The other aspect of lighting is that lights interact with materials. So our chair right now just has this kind of default white material. So all the lights kind of look, you can see sort of the basic product of the light there. But when the light interacts with our checkerboard material, obviously, the result is a little bit different. So there's a lot more that we can do with materials to change the way that they interact with the light. And we'll go over that in the second part of class. So that's it for now. Any questions or things you guys want to review? All right, so I'll stop.